In the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called out to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid." They heard God coming. They hid. God called out to them, "Where are you?" This passage from the 3rd chapter of Genesis has been classified in a variety of ways by people whose work it is to study and interpret biblical stories. Some say it's a story about primeval history and early creation and human origins. Still others say it's about the doctrine of original sin. Some say it is a myth. I tend to land on this last one, that it is a myth, in part because our Wednesday Bible study group was talking about mythology last week. And when we asked the question, what do we know about myths? One person said, "Myths aren't true. They are not true." I think a more accurate description might be this: myths may not be historically true, but they tell truths about all of us. In other words, true myths never really happened, but they happen all the time. The story of man, woman, God, and serpent points out truths that we may recognize in ourselves, proudly or not, but with the support of God's sense of humor. God does have a great sense of humor, especially in this story. When God discovers that the man and the woman have done exactly what he asked them not to do, there follows a great blame game, right? The man's pointing his finger at his wife. "She made me do it." The woman points to the serpent. "He made me do it." The serpent doesn't respond at all, but I can sort of imagine him sitting there with a, I don't know, a serpent smile, but a sort of sneaky-looking, serpenty look on his face, and saying, "Look at all this wonderful turmoil I've created here." Not only that, God just pronounced that woman will be afraid of me from now on. So this may be a myth, and it is also a story about taking responsibility and accepting consequences. These are truths about our lives that happen every day. Let's step back a little further in the story. The Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." Again, if we look at this story in a certain way, it's pretty ridiculous and silly. It's like a game of hide and seek, right? Where the seeker calls out, "Where are you?" and the person hiding says, "Here I am." This is not how the game is normally played. But in a different context, in the context of myth, it tells some truths about us. The man and the woman heard God calling and they hid. Yet just a little earlier in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, God said this, "Let us make humankind in our likeness. And it is not good that the man should be alone." So God built humankind to be in community and in communion with God. And yet, how often do we hide? How often do we turn away from God, either knowingly or unknowingly? The Apostle Paul would later describe very well this turmoil, this inner conflict that we may sense when we hide from God. When, as Paul said, we live only in the flesh and not also in the Spirit. He said this in his letter to the Romans: I do not understand my own actions, for I do not what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. I heard the sound of you in the garden, God, and I was afraid, and I hid myself. In the context of myth, the story of man and woman and God and serpent tells some truths about all of us. This is also a story about what happens when we let fear take over, hiding from the hard work of relationships, believing we can evade God when God seeks us out. Sorry, God, not today. I'm too busy. I'm too afraid. I'm too whatever. Fill in the blank for your own self. These are truths about all of us that happen every day. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden. What does God walking in the garden sound like? Even in the context of myth, I think there is a great space for the possibility to imagine what the sound of God is, to discover the ways that we hear God in the world around us. Some people may say it's the sound of a baby in church. It urges us to truly listen for God's presence and discern what God is calling us to, without hiding, without pointing fingers at someone else, and without covering up our own vulnerabilities. In the context of myth, the story of man and woman and God and serpent tells some truth about all of us. It is a story about holy listening. Holy listening. What is God asking us to do and not do? Who does God want us to be and not be? How can we respond faithfully and responsibly? These are questions we can all ask every day. As we go downstairs after the service this morning for our annual parish meeting, and first we're going to have our group picture taken, I invite you to enter into this time from a place of holy listening, for the truths about where God is calling us and who God is calling us to be, and how we can respond faithfully and responsibly, not hiding, but with our faces turned to each other and to God. Some stories like this one about man and woman and God and serpent are, in fact, myths. As such, they may not be historically true, but they tell us truths about ourselves. But the story of St. Matthias is different. There is history, there is truth, and listening for God, and hearing one another. So let's continue to tell the story of St. Matthias, be true to ourselves, and be open to where God is calling us next. Amen. Amen.